peace and power. I stand here with the backdrop behind me of the city of Dallas, an amazing, beautiful skyline. And most skylines in the city are there to represent and project an image of a city, that of prosperity, promise, and progress. But here in the city of Dallas, when we go from the backdrop, the skyline up high, and we go down low into the streets in many black communities and communities of color, prosperity, promise, and progress eludes many of us. And so we want to talk about the ways in which we can get engaged and have action, activism, and advocacy to change that. So one of the things we have to do is we come down into the streets is radically reimagine public safety, because one of the things that we have to deal with oftentimes in our black and minority communities is police violence, state-sanctioned violence. This form of physical violence is so traumatic that we see play out on TV almost every other day here in America, and right here in Dallas, Texas. You know, we think about and remember Botham Jean. We think about Atiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas. We still think about Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and we think about George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So for many of us, we have to make sure that we stay in this struggle for justice, peace, love, and liberation. We have to make sure that we stay in this struggle against state-sanctioned violence. So we have to make sure that we are part of a movement to bring about a more positive way of policing our community. So as we just talked about the forms of physical violence that many of our communities are up against and feel the brunt of by way of state-sanctioned murder, we also have to deal with the structural violence that takes place in places like this, Dallas City Hall, and many city halls around this country, state houses around this country, as well as the U.S. Congress. Public policy oftentimes is unleashed on our communities that wreaks havoc on our communities, and we have to deal with that as well. So we want to talk about some of the things that take place by way of public policy that we have to be aware of, that we have to educate ourselves on, so we can be better advocates and we can engage in activism to bring about a permanent change in our community so all of us can flourish and have access to life-giving, life-sustaining resources. So we left City Hall where we talked about where public policies are made that impact primarily black and other communities of color, and we stand now here behind me what was Shingle Mountain, which was a toxic waste dump right here in the city that was right next door to Marsha Jackson's, literally her backyard. And so through activism, advocacy, and action, we were able to get those shingles removed, but the fight is still far from over because the city of Dallas still has racist zoning policies that impact many of the residents who live here in Floral Farms. And so while the shingles maybe have been removed, we have to make sure all the toxic waste has not seeped down into the land. And so for us, we want to make sure we continue to be involved in environmental justice work, because we want to make sure that all of us have access to fresh air and clean water. And this is just one of the many places in our part of town where we have toxic waste and toxic dumps that impacts the health of those that we love. And so now we're going to look at one other place where the policy of the city and the state makes this possible. So now, just 3 miles from Shingle Mountain, we find another toxic waste dump right here in our community known as Lane Plating, which has been designated as a Superfund site by the federal government. So we still have to do all we can to make sure that in our communities that we are advocates to make sure we clean up our areas so that we too, once again, can have access to fresh air and clean water. And so as we continue to fight for justice in terms of environmental justice, another area that concerns us is economic justice. One of the things that proliferates our neighborhoods, particularly our black neighborhoods, are payday loan and auto title loan stores where they charge such excessive interest rates and rollover fees that traps people into a cycle of debt. So we want to also make sure that we do our part to have right policies, public policies that make fair lending practices, so those that must go get small dollar loans can do so without being trapped into debt. So this is yet another policy issue that we have to be concerned about and engaged in. We also want to make sure that we do our part to deal with food justice and food apartheid in many of our communities where access to fresh produce is often not attainable. And so here at Friendship West, a little over 11 years ago, myself along with so many other amazing volunteers started what we call the Village Co-op, which consists of a garden as well as a fair trade program. And we work with local farmers from East Texas to bring their produce right here to Friendship West in the community surrounding the church so people can have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And so we want to make sure that we do what we can also to be advocates around food justice policies and food budget items to ensure that all of God's children have access to food. So we have talked about many issues that are taking place here in the city of Dallas, but it happens all across this country in many of our areas where black and brown people live. And so now we conclude this tour of our city right here on this sacred ground, this ground where former enslaved African Americans founded this area of Dallas. And so for me, I remember and I think about all of their tenacity, their self-determination to make it in spite of what they found themselves up against by way of bad public policy. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do our part to engage in this ongoing struggle for justice, peace, love, and liberation, because while we may deal with so many examples of material impoverishments in our communities, whether it's environmental racism, economic injustice, police brutality, and the list goes on and on, food justice, what we have to remember is that we still do not lack, that we still have all that we need to create a world in our communities that allows all of us to flourish, because we are not lacking and we don't have a deficit when it comes to our rich culture and our rich heritage. We don't lack when it comes to our innovation, our imagination, and we certainly do not lack in our belief in a God who cares about us, who loves us, and who wants to make sure that our lives between Sundays is still full and allows us to flourish and be all that God has called all of us to be. So we're asking you, will you join us, partner with us, and become a justice partner today?